Executive Director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, which is titled Election Observation: How Authoritarian Regimes Muddy the Waters. Today's discussion is part of a larger initiative that's being undertaken by the International Forum, examining the ways in which resurgent authoritarian regimes increasingly are exerting influence and challenging democratic norms. Our initiative is looking at key authoritarian countries, focusing on what Partner calls the Big Five: China, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. But we're also examining key thematic areas in which authoritarians are learning from each other and cooperating. These areas include the global authoritarian crackdown on civil society, the ways in which authoritarian regimes are manipulating online discussion and trying to shape internet governance, the growing international media capacity that we see from countries such as Russia and China. RT is probably the best known of these. And then the larger question of authoritarian counternorms. This is this idea that authoritarian regimes are now finding ways, both through undermining and corroding existing international norms, but also by developing their own set of alternative norms through institutions such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Gulf Cooperation Council. Of course, today's discussion is on election observation, which is a subset of this new counternorm question. Articles on these countries and the thematic issues I've just mentioned will be published in the Journal of Democracy and then subsequently in an edited volume on this subject. One of the features of the authoritarian resurgence is that repressive regimes have become emboldened, and with growing ambition, they're seeking to impress their own values and standards upon existing rules-based institutions which support these standards. In recent years, authoritarian regimes have been devoting greater attention and using greater sophistication towards the veneer and perception of elections. Today's savvier, more media-conscious autocrats are taking an approach, this approach at an entirely new level. They are, for example, deploying fake monitoring groups that praise obviously flawed elections in an effort to drown out more critical assessments by established monitoring organizations. This sort of manipulation is just one part of a larger strategy used by the autocrats to undermine authentic election observation, and this will be the basis of our discussion today. Given the extent of the challenge to democratic norms in the election observation sphere and elsewhere, the established democracies need to rethink what it will take to meet this serious challenge. Quick word on social media for today's discussion. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow the discussion and contribute to the conversation by following the forum at Think Democracy, and you can follow the endowment at Ned Democracy. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the NED staff that helped organize today's event, and would also take this occasion to remind everyone, if you haven't already, to silence your cell phones. Let me now introduce our speakers. Start with Pat Merloe to my right. Patrick Merloe is a Senior Associate and Director of Electoral Programs at the National Democratic Institute, where he oversees programs on nonpartisan citizen election monitoring and advocacy for electoral integrity, political party electoral integrity activities, constitutional and law reform efforts concerning electoral rights, and international election observation. He has participated in over 150 NDI missions to more than 65 countries, concentrating on conflict-sensitive states and countries that are vulnerable to authoritarian tendencies. He's produced a dozen publications on comparative law, human rights, and elections, and served as the principal drafter and negotiator of the Declaration of Principles for International Election Observation, which has been endorsed by 38 international organizations. He's worked with United Nations bodies, other intergovernmental organizations, and non-governmental organizations, and has taught at the University of Pennsylvania's Law School and the University of San Francisco School of Law. Jan Surotchak, to my immediate left, is Regional Director for Europe at the International Republican Institute, where he oversees programming in the Baltic states, Central and Southeastern Europe, and Turkey, as well as outreach efforts for partner parties in Western Europe and institutions at the European Union level. He manages IRI's Leadership Institute for Central and Eastern Europe, European Political Party Foundation and Institute Network, and the City Craft Institute. He's also responsible for IRI's European Partner Initiative, through which the Institute develops relations with political parties in the EU, in particular the European People's Party and its member organizations. He's taken part in numerous IRI election observation missions and political assessments around the world. He co-edited IRI's study, Why We Lost, Explaining the Rise and Fall of the Center-Right in Central and Eastern Europe, 1996 to 2002. And Thomas O. Melia is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, DRL. He's responsible for DRL's work in Europe, including Russia and the South Caucasus, and in the countries of the Middle East and North Africa region. It's quite a portfolio. In addition to serving as head of delegation to several meetings of the OSCE, he was co-chair of the Civil Society Working Group in the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission. He came to DRL in 2010 from Freedom House, where Tom and I were colleagues, where he was Deputy Executive Director for 5 years, and before that he held senior posts at the NDI, including Vice President for Programs. From 1999 to 2010, he taught at Georgetown University and the University School of Advanced International Studies. So all three of our speakers have extensive experience and knowledge on in the subject we're discussing today. And with that, I'm pleased to hand things over to Pat Merloe.
Thanks, Chris. I was trying to think about how you introduce some kind of levity into topics like this. As those of you have heard me speak before, I always search for some. So my first thought was maybe to come wearing a zombie mask, since we're going to talk about zombie election observers. And then I thought a little bit about our title, about muddying the waters, and it seemed more likely that if I went to Muddy Waters and came up with a blues theme, that might fit where we are. And particularly, those of you who read today in the New York Times Thomas Friedman's piece about the democratic recession. There's one point that Tom Friedman and Larry Diamond in his Journal of Democracy article on the subject agree, and that is that the actions of the United States and other major democracies matter. They matter on this point, and they matter on the broader point about democratic recession. And in effect, we might ask ourselves whether the answer to a recession, if there is one, is to have a democratic austerity and to pull back on, or whether we should have a democratic stimulus and try to push forward in our activities supporting people around the world. I mentioned this this morning to one of my colleagues, Keith Jennings, who said, well, maybe what you should open with is by saying that I don't see anybody out there demonstrating for more authoritarianism in the squares around the world, that the idea of democracy is very much alive. I've been asked to frame this topic today rather than to do the deep dive into it, which I'm happy to give examples when we go into the Q&A session. But it is important to realize that we're in a circumstance where the new Freedom House report notes that there's a 9-year trend where there is more declines of countries in political rights and civil liberties than countries that are going up. And part of this probably is because of the encouragement to authoritarians around the world that we see, of course, from Russia's aggressiveness and outright aggression in Ukraine, the assertiveness that China is playing around the globe, even the role perhaps of regional powers like Venezuela in promoting a populist dogmatism within its sphere of influence. It's coupled in some ways also, I think, with the perception at least that the United States and other major democracies are somewhat de-emphasizing human rights and democracy promotion around the world, whether that perception is accurate or not. And it's cast in the light of the protracted economic difficulties that we've faced around the globe and in the West, and also the tremendous weight and challenge of facing the really extraordinary level of violence that are coming from non-state actors, and the temptation to look in other ways, to take the so-called hard approach, the realist approach, or as we hear in Latin America, the mano duro approach, rather than the democratic approach to these things. But when we look at the trends that are out there that are troubling, we have to also note there are norms for which the counternorms are being developed. There's a democratic foundation that we all have to keep in mind as we look at the picture in the globe today. And to me, I was thinking this morning about the fact that there were fewer than a dozen democracies at the close of World War II in that incredible battle against horrendous authoritarianism. At the time when the rise of the Iron Curtain was taking place, when military dictatorships proliferated in the world, and when colonialism was trying to reestablish its footing. And fast forwarding over the incredible dramatic global developments from then until today, Freedom House, if we go back to that survey, notes that there are 125 electoral democracies today in the world. Larry Diamond has a slightly smaller number, but that's the majority of the countries in the world today in some way portray themselves and in many ways actually are democratic. There is an expectation that has been established that countries be democratic, that they respect human rights, and that they hold credible elections to validate their government's authority. That is a tremendous force for us to use in our work looking forward. The power of that norm and the operation of that norm, whether it's through international human rights treaties or the obligations imposed by intergovernmental organizations, or the fact that the US, the EU, and others, however inconsistently, use this as one of the measures in determining international relations bilaterally and unilaterally. Along with the norm of democratic elections, credible elections, has come election monitoring. Election monitoring is generally accepted not just by international observers around the world, but by citizen observers. And why? I think there are at least 2 points that we have to keep in mind for the foundation of election monitoring as part of the normative development that we all are living within. And that's, first, through constitutions, not countries obliged to hold elections, they're obliged to protect and even to foster the freedom of expression. Freedom of expression includes the right to seek, receive, and impart information. And certainly that applies to information about elections. Because to say that citizens have a right to genuine elections, you have to also say that citizens have a right to know that their elections are indeed genuine. To exercise the freedom of expression, to investigate the various elements of an election process. And the second underpinning for citizen election monitoring is that citizens have a right to participate in government and public affairs. And certainly, elections are a quintessential government affair. It's not just the passive act or relatively passive act of going to cast a ballot. It's the act of looking into each and every element that's important in making an election process genuine. And that takes me to the next point that I want to make, and that many of you in this room already know quite well. And that's elections are not a one-day event. Elections are comprised of a series of processes that take place over a long period of time. To understand whether an election is genuine or sham, we have to know, for example, how citizens prove their birth in order to establish not just their age, but their citizenship. A requirement to qualify for the ballot, to stand as a candidate, or a requirement to be on the voter registry. And this process is something that has to be looked into across the globe, including perhaps even within this country, and whether there's barriers to citizens gaining access in that way, or whether there's a free flow of citizens' access to participate as voters and as candidates. We have to look at whether the data is available to analyze election districts. Are they properly drawn? Is there really equal suffrage to vote in one district of the number of people, more or less the same as in others? You have to be able to access the voter registry to determine whether the population data that's there is real or whether it somehow has been padded or inflated, or whether those who have just come of age somehow have been denied access to that registry. There's a whole range of things that take us up through the processes that happen on election day. Whether violence has been used to derail free expression and free thought at the polling station, whether intimidation or other things have been used as a way to coerce people to stay out of the process or to vote one way or another. Whether the results and the processes themselves are genuine, means access to data, witnesses being available. And of course, whether people accept the results and use complaint mechanisms is another element that takes us all the way around one calendar after another rather than a given day. So election monitoring, if you're an autocrat today, means looking at not just keeping a certain number of people out of polling stations on a given date. It means controlling the narrative about the nature of the political process in the country, which means looking at election observation, we have to place ourselves in the broader spectrum of what authoritarians and the rise of authoritarians are doing to debilitate political discourse, the challenge of opposition, to disenable and disempower civil society, and to gut the freedom of the press and the media. This is something that has a particular character when it comes to citizens stepping forward, not just as media, but as they organize themselves in civil society to do a kind of systematic election observation of all of these processes, a type of specialized human rights defenders, if you will. And the pressure that comes against them comes in a number of ways. These are ways that we can click off as we look at, as Chris said, some of the broader topics over these seminars. It comes in restrictive NGO laws that prohibit monitoring or that prohibit foreign funding for monitoring. It comes in the regulations that block NGOs and limit the numbers of people who might be accredited, or that overly burden the opportunity to receive accreditation by charging fees, by requiring people all to bring photographs to the Capitol in order to get ID cards that are issued at the end of the day, at the last moment, by blocking entrance to polling stations and forcing people to leave over the course of processes, or raiding and disrupting headquarters, as we've seen in Zimbabwe and other places, by threatening monitors and their families, by detaining people, by false prosecutions, as we've seen recently in Azerbaijan, placing in jail the leaders of the citizen election monitoring, by defamation of character and discrediting the credibility of the groups that are doing this kind of work. And of course, by setting up pro-government NGOs. Our favorite phrase in this, of course, the gongos, who before they ever start are very well resourced, who the doors are open for, who are on the government media, and who get to speak to the people as part of the attempt to create a Potemkin village. The same as government-controlled media themselves gain the access and the privilege that a free press is denied in these circumstances. And then I have to say something to end this introduction about international observers. Because the freedom of expression and the norm for democratic elections has operated to the benefit of internationals as well. The idea of whether people are having their genuine right to choose those who will govern is not just a matter of national constitutions. It's a matter of stability of government and a matter that's of concern to the international community as a whole. We can go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its Article 21, or we can come forward with some of the recent charters in Africa about elections and democracy and other places. It's one of the fundamental concerns of the international community as well. And with that, there's come to organize international observers, a rather ragtag group 20 years ago plus when Tom Melia and I just met. But over the course of time, a number of organizations, including the people at this panel, have helped to develop the standards and the principles by which observation should take place. And eventually, the core organizations that are best known for doing credible international observation came together around a declaration of principles. That declaration has since been acknowledged on 3 occasions by UN General Assembly resolutions for contributing to raising the credibility and to harmonizing the approach of international observers so that there's less possibilities of differing conclusions about the nature of a given election. With that, just as the proliferation of citizen observation has spread in 25 plus years to more than 90 countries, and an organization supported by the National Endowment of Democracy of the global network of citizen election observers with over 200 organizations from 80 plus countries in it, and its declaration of principles allows the public and the media, both national and international, to determine who's credible and who's not. The autocrats have been busy bringing forward their own version of not just gongos, but international observers. First, of course, it's easy to hire your friends and to pay their way to your election, to give them a microphone and a podium to speak what you know they would say before they ever left home, to endorse what is really a phony process. It's also a tactic that has been used to reach inside credible organizations, to try to stack the observers that come. A recent example in Azerbaijan was an attempt to reach inside the European Parliament to ensure that the lead spokesperson was someone who already was committed to the Azerbaijani government and saying good things about the election, to reach inside the Council of Europe's delegation to ensure that the chief observer, again, was a sympathetic person who would speak in favor of the government, and to try to destabilize the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's observation by creating turmoil within that delegation. There have been cases in other places in the world, in the Southern African Development Community, where the SADC Forum has been used to bring in sympathetic observers to Zimbabwe to make positive pronouncements about that election, and where the SADC and parliamentary assemblies have been used in other places in advance to try to destabilize. The international observers also have faced what we do refer to almost lovingly as zombie observers. And observers really tend to be people who are well-known, well-intentioned, but not very knowledgeable about the country concerned. They're invited more or less as tourists, kept more or less as captives, fed information by the government, escorted to specific polling stations where what they witness is something that seems to be quite credible, and then invited to make pronouncements upon the scene. These observers, of course, are used as the counterpoint to the critical comments that come from systematic citizen election observation and from the credible international observers, and are used in international forums by autocratic governments to try to gain a fig leaf of credibility over the true nature of the phony elections that they try themselves to organize. And this is a phenomenon that also, I think, deserves some attention. International observers tend to face less often the things that citizen observers face, being denied access to polling stations or being denied access to data that's necessary to analyze elections. But they, too, are sometimes subjected to late invitations, limitations on their numbers, told that people from certain countries can't come, and other ways of trying to restrict their ability to do their job. And with that, I'll end and hope that we'll have time in the Q&A to talk about what are some of the things that we, sitting here in Washington and our various organizations, can do to combat these phenomena.
Thank you, Pat, for an outstanding introduction. You managed somehow to be both comprehensive and succinct, which is just great. So now I'd like to hand things over to Jan, move us a little bit more focused in regional terms, get his sense of how these issues are impacting most acutely.
The magic there. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Pat, for leading beautifully into exactly what I was going to present. So clearly a well-prepared panel. I do want to say specifically thanks to Chris for keeping our collective attention focused on these issues, the issues we're talking about here today. I think it's critically important to have the NED playing this role here in Washington and sitting where I normally sit, which is in Bratislava. I only wish that there were more organizations like this one in the various capitals of Europe to help focus such attention there. It's not to say that there aren't any. They do exist, but the transatlantic community surely would benefit from having more of them around Europe. I'd also like to say it's an honor and a privilege to sit up here with Tom, who I will always remember as the person who sprung me from an Italian jail and liberated me from some excellent cappuccino, I might add. It's a long and complicated story, which I'd be happy to talk about later, but I do really appreciate his help. For our purposes today, I will only be focusing on Europe and Russian activity there, and not on the similarly nefarious efforts of other authoritarian regimes that Pat has mentioned in other parts of the world. Sadly, there's enough going on, enough bad going on in Europe to more than fill a 12-minute presentation. Because so much of the Russian activity in this field is centered both on co-opting Europeans into its effort and on having an impact on policy and policymakers in Europe. Before turning to some specific attempts to have an impact on the credibility of elections around the region, I'd like to say just a few words about how I think this fits into the larger Russian effort to engage politically in Europe. Many of you in the room today will no doubt empathize with me when I say that as little as 10 years ago, I was asking myself whether or not to continue to refer on my resume to my graduate studies using the term Soviet studies, because frankly there didn't seem to be much marketability in it anymore. Now, however, I'm somehow disturbingly pleased that I didn't delete that reference, because in so many ways it has come around to be marketable again, thanks to Vladimir Putin, as we find ourselves talking once more about fellow travelers, front organizations, useful idiots, and other such terminology that we all remember. Other experts in the field, some of which you've had speak here, have done extensive and excellent research on the influence that Russia is exerting on a wide range of political parties in Europe, and today's not the day to go into that effort in detail. But I think it is important for our discussion today to understand that one of the paybacks that Russia obtains from investments in such parties as the Front National in France, or Jobbik in Hungary, or Ataka in Bulgaria, and others, is a pool of ready participants to help spread Moscow's message on important elections around the region and to influence policy in their home countries. I'm happy to talk about any of this increased Russian activity at any time, however, if that's helpful, either in the Q&A or afterwards today. Now I'd like to just run through a quick list of organizations that have been active over the last several years in monitoring elections in Europe, and they of course have two primary purposes, some of which Pat has touched on. The first is to call into question the legitimacy of elections that Moscow views as delivering results that are not in its interest. And the second is to confirm the legitimacy of those elections that delivered the results that Moscow desires. Various types of Russian-supported organizations and individuals have been active since at least the early 2000s in both of these kinds of efforts, among others in South Ossetia, Ukraine, Transnistria, the Baltic states, and Crimea, many, many other places as well. I'm going to list several of them here and go into some detail on each of them, with the caveat that I'm not pretending to present an exhaustive list. There are many, many others that are out there that are working with less publicity and perhaps fewer and resources. The first that I'd like to talk about today is the Eurasian Observatory for Democracy and Elections, EODE, in case you didn't have enough acronyms in your life already. Which says of itself that it maintains a presence in Moscow, Paris, Brussels, Sochi, Chisinau, Istanbul, and Yaoundé, which I thought was a bit far afield, but nonetheless, and which most recently notoriously fielded observation missions for the March 2014 Crimean referendum and the November 2014 so-called parliamentary elections in Donetsk and Luhansk. Using its own self-definition, EODE is, quote, committed to a multipolar world, end quote, and to, quote, the unity of Eurasia, designed as a geopolitical entity, end quote. Its vision of the world, it says, is, quote, shared by many governmental and political spheres, including the current Russian leadership and VV Putin, end quote. The EODE is led by Belgian far-right activists, two of them, Luc Michel and Jean-Pierre van der Missen, who have a long history of being tied together with neo-Nazi fascist strains of thought and action in Belgium. Although, if you follow Jean-Pierre van der Missen on his Facebook page, he lists his residence in Thailand these days. Go to the website, go to the Facebook page, it's really fascinating. The participant lists of both the Crimean and Donetsk-Luhansk EODE observation missions reads like a who's who of Russian apologists in the European Union, both from the radical right and the radical left, depending on which side of the spectrum is more pro-Russian in each country. If you're looking at the delegates that they take from Austria and Italy, they're largely. If you look at the delegates they take from Germany, it's largely the far left, with a couple of small exceptions. But the representation that they deliver is quite geographically diverse, and the missions are not small. In Crimea, the EODE deployed at least 33 observers, and in Donetsk and Luhansk, it was at least 39. Just for comparison, In the legitimate Ukrainian parliamentary elections in October 2014, another humble NGO that we call IRI deployed a total of 30 delegates and staff in all of Ukraine. Now, there were, of course, similar missions from our friends at NDI and many others. But, just for the sake of defining the kinds of delegations, the scope of delegations that these organizations can turn up. No one will be surprised to know that in both cases, the EODE declared the respective processes to have been completely legitimate and without issue. And the post-election press conference that was held by the group in Kiev is of particular interest. You can see it on YouTube. And I'll come back to that in a few moments because it highlights another effort that is underway to undermine legitimate observation processes. For more useful information, although it's uneven, please go to the EODE's website. But I would recommend checking out their Facebook page, which is chock full of fascinating little that they use to try to represent their perspective on the referendum in Crimea, the elections in eastern Ukraine, and elsewhere. It's really quite advanced and quite sophisticated. Next on the list is something called the European Center for Geopolitical Analysis, ECGA, which is based in Poland, sometimes said to be in Warsaw, sometimes said to be in Szczecin, tough to say, but also identifies contacts in both Moscow and Berlin. The ECGA is run by a Polish far-right political figure, Mateusz Piskorski, who you may have come across over the years, who has figured in a number of political parties in Poland. For its part, the ECGA advertises in its materials that it's, quote, it says about itself, our monitoring services have already been twice highly estimated by the Central Election Commission of the Russian Federation. I don't know whether estimated means in what they were paid or in what they did. Could just be a bad translation. Which granted the ECGA, as the only international NGO, it says, exclusive access and accreditation to observe the parliamentary and presidential elections in the Russian Federation. The beginnings of the ECGA take us to another organization called the Commonwealth of Independent States Election Monitoring Organization, CISEMO, and its leader, who you've also probably come across, Alexei Kochetkov. CISEMO has a long list of monitoring missions on its record, including in Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and elsewhere, where the organization's reports are always aligned with the views of the Russian government. In short, if a Kremlin candidate wins, the elections are fair. If there's a surprise, it turns out that the balloting should be repeated. Kochetkov is also tied, as many of you probably also know, to something called the Quorum Center for monitoring democratic processes in Russia. And Kochetkov originally engaged Mateusz Piskorski, to whom I referred earlier, in its election monitoring processes in the 2000s, out of which the ECGA has grown in Poland. Now, it can be both confusing and frustrating to try to disaggregate the election observation missions of the ECGA and the EODE from one another because Piskorski turns up on EOD list, and Michel turns up on ECGA lists. And they clearly both draw on the same pool of people from across Europe. As to Piskorski himself, he's now, for those of you who follow Poland and right-wing politics in Poland, he is now in the process of co-founding another new political party called Change, the mission of which is to spread information regarding the conflict in eastern Ukraine. The founding congress of the party is this Saturday. And at the first meeting of the party this Saturday, a group of former self-defense politicians, people came from Andrei Lepper's self-defense party, are getting together to form this new creation. And they've made sort of a splash in the Polish press by inviting representatives of so-called Novorossiya to take part in the founding Congress. The next group we'll address is not actually an organization as such, but an entity proposed by one of the most frequent participants in both EODE and ECGA missions, former Austrian MP and MEP, Ewald Stadler, who's gone through pretty much all of the political parties on the right in the Austrian spectrum, and who also has just recently started one of his own. In any case, I want to come back to the press conference that I mentioned earlier in the Donbass after the so-called elections there. Stadler proposed the creation of something called the Agency for Security and Cooperation in Europe, ASCE, to act as a Russian apologist mechanism undermining the OSCE. Now, you laugh, and it may seem a little bit silly on its face, sort of along the lines of, will the real OSCE please stand up? But it does point out another aspect, I think, of how Moscow seeks to influence observation missions by associating illegitimate missions with those that credible organizations field. Here's a tangible example. In March 2014, Rossiya 24 claimed that Luc Michel of the EODE was the organizer of the OSCE election observation mission in Crimea. Later in the year, Novosti also claimed that OSCE monitors were present at polling stations in Donetsk and Luhansk, which was patently untrue. And the real OSCE promptly tweeted a denial and denied any knowledge thereof, but the damage, of course, at that point had already been done. The pro-Russian positions taken by their kept monitoring groups had been presented publicly as those of the OSCE. So these are just three quick examples of the types of organizational approaches that Moscow seems to be using to help shape opinion with regard to elections that matter both to it and the West across the region. I haven't talked about other related efforts here, such as the financial support of pro-Russian parties in the member and associate member states of the EU. You're all aware, of course, of the funding for the Front National in France. The frequent appearance of representatives of kept pro-Russian parties on such media as RTV. Chris mentioned RTV at the outset. It's incredibly dangerous and expanding its influence all the time now into the German language media. The ways in which pro-Russian parties attempt to introduce legislation in their home countries that supports Moscow. Just last week, Ataka in Bulgaria attempted to have the legislature there consider recognition of the Russian annexation of Crimea. Didn't go anywhere, of course, but you can expect to see these things come back time and time again. And last but not least, the use of client parties to undermine the economic stability of the European Union and its member states, Greece. And increasingly, I'm afraid, and this will play out this year, we'll see how it goes, Spain as well. So the ties of Russia to these types of faux election observation missions that I've outlined here today are only one small part of a much broader effort underway for Moscow. But for those of us who are concerned about the long-term stability of democratic institutions in Europe, I think they're of grave concern. Thanks for your attention. Be happy to try to answer any questions you might have in the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Jan. Those are really terrific details and give a sense of the many ways in which this influence is being exerted. So it's a terrific complementary set of presentations. Let's turn now to Tom Melia to get his comments and observations on this challenge.
Okay. Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks to the National Endowment for Democracy and the International Forum for Democratic Studies for bringing us all together today. I, too, am flattered to be associated with this distinguished panel, whom I've known and been associated with for too many years to relate. And we will talk about Jan's escape from the Italian cappuccino machine in the prison in northern Italy on the shores of Lake Como, wasn't it? Yes, indeed. It was not the worst prison to be in, but
no, if you have to be.
But there's no good prison to be in. So, the importance of this series and today's discussion that Chris described at the outset is underscored by the current issue of the Journal of Democracy, which, as you know, features a whole raft of articles on the question of whether democracy is in decline, and includes one or two demurrals that say democracy is not actually in decline, although the prevailing gloominess that is reflected in the Tom Friedman piece in today's times, I think, gives rise to more and more discussions like this. And I'm going to try to end in a few minutes on an upbeat note that says we shouldn't be quite as gloomy even as we gather ourselves for what is a heightened challenge to defend and promote democracy worldwide. When we think about the rise and fall of democracy in the world and whether a year's events, a series of elections or a coup or backsliding here and there, I'm tempted to think that we should judge it in the same kind of terms that we debate climate change. You know, does this year's cold winter or dry season mean that climate change has been confirmed, or is it an anomaly in a decade-long series of data or a century-long perspective? And I think that I would tend generally to go with the more 50-year, 100-year trend lines and look at those, in which I think generally the trends for democracy remain positive over the medium to longer term as we look back, and I suspect over the medium to longer term as we look forward as well. So I'm tempted not to get too dismayed by the current 9-year trend of decline that Freedom House has so ably tracked. And I want to go to the title of today's event and maybe discuss that a bit. So the title of today's event, Chris began with, Election Observation, How Authoritarian Regimes Muddy the Waters. And I think I would have written it a little differently. I would have said how authoritarian regimes try to muddy the waters. Because I'm not sure they do. The groups that Jan just described, I've never heard of them. And I've been following elections in these countries, including in Donetsk and Luhansk. And if they issued a statement on the day after those purported elections last November, it dropped like a rock in the ocean. I don't think anybody took them very seriously. Now, there may be certain sub-audiences in some countries, in some communities that are captives of controlled media that think that those are legitimate statements. But, I mean, nobody in this room was dissuaded or persuaded by any of those groups, or by the many efforts by a variety of authoritarian governments to stand up gongos and phony observer groups to issue overly rosy statements about subpar elections in the former Soviet space or more widely in the world. You know, there's a competitive information market out there. There's lots of wacky ideas and bad information and false statements circulating in the world. But certainly Freedom House hasn't been fooled by any of them. They're able to do an annual survey of the state of political rights in countries around the world and get it about right most years. And certainly the human rights reports that the State Department produces aren't fooled by any of these gongos or phony intergovernmental organizations and their false statements. So I'm not quite sure that the investment, and it is considerable in some cases, by governments in South Caucasus and in Russia and more widely in the world, and they do spend some money on this stuff. I'm just not sure it's really paying off for them, at least yet. I mean, maybe somewhere down the road it may, but I don't know that any of those governments are bolstered necessarily in the real world, the real international community, by the phony validation that they try to get from these phony election observers, whether intergovernmental or NGO like. So I'm not dismayed yet. I mean, I'm concerned and I'm entertained by Jan's review of EODE and ECGA and the ASCE. We need more acronyms in Washington, so it's good to have these on the table so that we can try to work them into our daily discourse. So there's that. On the other hand, there are governments that we in the U.S. government have to deal with that are not elected through legitimate electoral processes. They sometimes try to validate themselves through subpar or phony elections. And then there are a number of governments that don't even pretend to have elections. You saw that President Obama stopped in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on his way home from his recent trip to India to meet the new king and to demonstrate how important Saudi Arabia is to the United States regionally and globally. There hasn't been much like an election in Saudi Arabia in some time, but we've got a government there that we deal with on a daily and sometimes hourly basis, as we do with governments elected, semi-elected, and unelected all over the world. There's very, very few, it's very, very rare that the U.S. treats a nominally elected government, president, or legislature as something other than the de facto governing institution that it presents itself as. Very, very few, very rare. Ultimately, the question about, well, if we, what's the point of the election observation? Are we going to decide that there are some governments that are beyond the pale and we're not going to deal with them because they presented themselves or they continued in office due to a flawed or fraudulent election process? And the answer is mostly not. We're going to continue to deal with them like they're the government of the day in the country that they're presiding over, even while we might wish that there was a more genuine participatory political process and might actually be doing something to move in that direction, to help the people of a country move their country in a better direction, as the U.S. often does through the considerable appropriations that we marshal and that we deploy to support the work of NDI and IRI, and that many institutions represented in this room to go forth and share information and advice on how to move various countries' politics in a more democratic, participatory direction. So we can be pro-democracy, but we still have to deal with governments that we have to deal with because they're all over the world. And so the clarity that comes from international and domestic observer networks is important and valuable in many ways, but ultimately isn't going to determine whether we deal with the government, have an embassy, take their ambassador here, send our ambassador there, and do a myriad other things with governments that we have to do in the world, even while we would like the world to be more democratic. And in this regard, I want to underscore that it is important that the governments need NGOs. Governments like the U.S. government really need independent election observers, like two organizations represented here and a number of others. That's, in fact, why we provide the funding we do through the NED, which we in the executive branch don't control, of course, their core funding, but through USAID and other U.S. Funding mechanisms that do support election monitoring and domestic election monitoring, because we want there to be an independent voice out there to state for the record what the character of the process was. Some of us inside the government use these statements much more often than you think, because in internal discussions about whether in fact a government is as stable as it says it is, if it's presenting itself as stable, popular, backed by popular demand, and we know and can point to credible statements from independent observers that in fact it's not in place by popular demand, that helps us in the internal policy deliberations. And so I can tell you, quite frankly and honestly, that these kinds of statements and the broader assessments that Pat described, not just what happened on election day, but in the season preceding a vote count and in the days and weeks after vote casting and counting, we do use them a lot, and it is a helpful, important reference point for many of us inside the U.S. government. And the world also needs intergovernmental observers, not the AirSats ones that Jan described, but the real ones. And the OSCE and the Office for Democratic Initiatives and Human Rights, ODIHR, which is based in Warsaw, and does the most high-quality international election monitoring of any intergovernmental body, is a very important reference for us. In fact, it's the U.S. government policy to wait for the preliminary statements of the ODIHR missions in those countries where they have missions and where they issue statements before we say anything about an electoral process. So on the day after or a couple days after, when people are clamoring for the U.S. government to commentate on an election that has taken place, one of the reasons we may be pausing is that we're waiting for the ODIHR statement to come out so that we can be informed by it, and generally so that we can echo and elevate it and reinforce it also, because it is our policy to support the OSCE and particularly ODIHR's missions, not only through funding, but also politically by respecting and echoing their findings when it's appropriate, which it usually is, and also by seconding observers from the U.S. government to join those delegations in the countries they go to. I wish we had more organizations like that in the world, where regional bodies and regional institutions could as consistently have as professional, intelligent assessments with integrity that we could similarly point to. But most other regions don't have a comparable body, even though in some cases there are good delegations and election missions put together by regional bodies, it's not as consistent or consistently of the quality that we get from ODIHR and from the OSCE. Should all problematic elections be monitored? Now, I recall in this OSCE context, in January of 2011, I think it was, when President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan was a year or two into his term, and after an effort by his legislature to name him president for life, which there was a lot of international pushback on, and that was taken off the agenda by the president, who said, well, the people want me to be president for life, but other people say it's not the done thing. So he rejected it. He vetoed the bill that had come to him from his legislature. Suddenly, and there was some will recall, there was a summit meeting of the OSCE in Astana in December of 2010. In the month after that, in January, there was suddenly a new effort afoot, which was to have an early presidential election, and which then took place a few weeks later, and to revalidate and extend the president's term. And there was a discussion in the OSCE about whether to monitor this election, given the circumstances of it and given the paucity of competition and the unplanned nature of it and all that. And I thought we shouldn't. I thought that we should discourage the OSCE from monitoring it, given what it was. And I got no traction in the OSCE, or very much in the US government. And the argument was that we need to monitor every election exercise in the region that we can throughout the OSCE region, so that we have a precedent that governs, so that when there is a really controversial or important or uncertain election where we really, really want observers, that we can point to an unbroken string of election monitoring across the region. And so a very large OSCE ODIHR delegation went to watch a virtually uncontested presidential election in the middle of winter in Kazakhstan, in the interests of sustaining that precedent, so that the OSCE could present itself in other dicier elections where there might be more resistance from the host government. And so that argument prevailed, and I think there's something to that. And in the couple of years since then, I've become more and more persuaded that elections should be monitored by credible, independent institutions, whether intergovernmental or non-governmental, wherever possible, so that we have a credible, independent voice. And so even in last year's controversial elections in Egypt, there was a referendum on the constitution, and then there was a presidential election. And NDI and IRI were shut out because of the NGO trial and all the complications around their presence in Egypt. There was some controversy about whether the U.S. government should finance and support a monitoring project that was undertaken by Democracy International for USAID. And there was some people that said, well, it's such a bad process that it's not worth monitoring. And in the end, I think it was right to monitor it. It was right to have done that. Democracy International did produce a statement that I thought was informed and appropriately critical. It praised what was worth praising, and it was appropriately critical about the larger political environment. And again, that's become an important reference for us in the U.S. government to be able to point to an independent assessment that provided, I think, a credible, honest statement. I should say at this point, since I've just cited Democracy International and touted their good work last year, that I'm going to leave the U.S. government next month and go work for Democracy International. So I don't want that to go unsaid here, since that's abroad in town and many people know that. But, frankly, one of the reasons is that I thought they did a darn good job in Egypt last year in what was a really difficult environment. And there was a lot of pressure on them in Washington and elsewhere not to do it for the reasons, that people didn't want to validate a process. But I think in the end they didn't do any more validation of the process than was appropriate. And they were honestly critical in some important ways that I think, upon reflection, and it stands the test of time if you go back and look at their statements last year on both of those electoral processes. So I think elections should be monitored by whichever credible, honest, professional organizations do exist and can be mobilized. Again, there's often hurdles posed, as was mentioned earlier, by governments with visas and other gates that can be blocked to keep independent observers out. So I'd say yes, observe where you can, when you can. And we in the U.S. government will support that in various ways, and we'll try to use those statements to good ends. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks to all of the speakers for their opening remarks. Before we turn it to the audience for questions, I'd like to ask a question that's fundamental, which is why do these regimes do this? And just coming to Tom Melia's observation on the title of today's event, how authoritarian regimes muddy the waters, seems to me that they are muddying the waters. The question is, to what degree is that effective in having an impact? We've discussed the many different kind of chunks of mud that are being tossed into the water. The question is whether it's effective, and I think at the domestic level, the creation of phony monitors can be seen to really have some purpose, which is to give domestic audiences a sense that it's not just these outsiders that are looking to impose their values and systems, but we have an alternative here. And in fact, we have these senators and representatives from Brussels and others who come, and they say that things are pretty good, and that's what's shown on our TV. I think that's a problem, and that's a challenge. But authoritarian regimes have always sought to manipulate what they can control within their borders. What's more disturbing is what's happening beyond their borders. And the efforts, both through use of media and through the things that Pat and Jan alluded to in the European context, where even if some of this seems to be a bit bizarre, at least at first glance, enlisting these fringe politicians, they continue to do it and make an investment in it. So at least from the perspective of the investors, there's something to it. Either we're misapprehending it and it's a waste of money, or there's something else to it and there's some ambition. So I'd just be curious for your reaction on why they're doing this, apart from just skewing the domestic perception of the election outcomes within their borders with what they can control.
Well, I'd take a point that Tom Melia made, which is that and I think it's the commonality actually between the editorial that we saw this morning and Larry Diamond's piece, and that is elections matter. It matters in the sense of what the United States, the European Union, and other major democracies do, how they key off of the issue of whether a country is democratic or whether a country is autocratic. It makes a difference. On the one hand, as I mentioned, I won't repeat myself, there is a democratic norm. There is an expectation. There is today a sense in governments that they are obliged, either by their constitution or by their international obligations, to deliver an election to the citizens so that the citizens can validate the authority of government. That's the norm. That's what's expected. And when I teach international law, that's a great example that I sometimes use. There are consequences when you fall or are labeled autocratic or authoritarian. The consequences vary because those countries that have the ability and those companies that do business with your country have the ability to either react strongly or not react at all. And there's inconsistencies, of course, in the way these reactions come. But just give a couple examples. The Commonwealth. The Commonwealth suspended Zimbabwe in 2002 for what were incredibly violent and repressive elections. They were not democratic. The Commonwealth suspended Pakistan more than once for military coups. Pakistan was readmitted to the Commonwealth in 2008 after its elections were deemed credible. Fiji was suspended from the Commonwealth more than once, the last time in 2010 for its failure to hold elections. And just this last October, when its elections were deemed credible by international observers, Fiji was readmitted fully to the Commonwealth. Now, we might question, and we can deconstruct what it means to be a full member or a suspended member of the Commonwealth. It certainly didn't cause, as Tom was referring, it didn't cause the end of bilateral relationships or diplomatic relations between countries, but it did affect the way those countries were treated within the club of nations. So there are some consequences that go along with being called out for having sham elections and phony elections. There are some consequences domestically as well, and I won't go on. But the point is, elections should accomplish two things in a country. They should resolve peacefully the competition for political power, and they should allow the citizens to show who is going to have their authority to govern, and without going off and sounding like a French philosopher about the nature of the social contract. This does have an effect upon how citizens feel about their government. And my joke in the morning that citizens are not out on their national squares demonstrating for more authoritarianism. Citizens over the history of authoritarianism have fought to end their oppression and to have governments that reflect their will and are based on their authority. So stability is a factor. If you can somehow fool some of the people some of the time, you will have more stability both domestically and internationally than if it's just blatantly clear you didn't bother to hold elections, or your elections were phony, or were really an expression of violent suppression, as the runoff election in Zimbabwe was in 2008. So without going on, I think we can see why these regimes take the time to try to control the narrative and try to ingratiate themselves, not just at home, but also in the foreign capitals that matter, and why there are quite a number of organizations on K Street that are making some good fees for doing the work on behalf of governments like Azerbaijan.
I know, Pat, I've heard you say in the past that the three principles that are integral to the election process are inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. Those, of course, are features that are in short supply in the authoritarian settings, and it seems that at least the effort is to, by the authoritarians, is to migrate those features beyond their borders into the intergovernmental bodies. I think the question is how successful they are to date. In those ends.
We should pass it on, but just let me say that I've been invited, as Tom Melia was one of the people who, while he's been in government, has invited me to participate as a member of the U.S. State Department delegation as a private citizen to the OSCE's Human Dimension meeting. There's a week-long, 2-week-long series, as you know, on many topics in the Human Dimension meetings, and there's one day on elections. And I sat in the chair of the United States of America, commenting upon the nature of elections in the OSCE arena, sitting opposite the chairman of the Russian Election Commission, and had the great enjoyment of having sparring with him over the nature of elections in the arena according in Russia. It is not lost on the 50-plus participating states of the OSCE, who is a genuine democracy with all of their problems, and which states are essentially autocratic in nature. And it is an arena in which people seek to have prestige, not just because of the human dimension, but because of the security dimension, as we would talk today about the observers in Ukraine, and also about the economic dimension. So, Putin sent one of his most trusted people, the chairman of the Election Commission, to represent Russia there. The United States picked me, so that might say something about the nature of the emphasis. But this has been a debate that has gone on, and I think I agree with Tom Melia also that the phony observers aren't picked up so much by credible international media and by those members of parliaments and the executives in democratic countries. They do know pretty much who are the credible observers and listen to them. So let me, with your indulgence, just end my diatribe by saying I do think that the point that the established democracies and how they act matter. And in that sense, we have to urge ourselves and our governments to be more steadfast and to have more energy on the human rights and democracy front. And I do think that, you know, the countermeasures to the authoritarians have to include, first, support to citizens, because social contract is a reality. And the government do belong to the citizens. And supporting citizen groups in their efforts to hold government accountable, including through elections, is very important. And the work that's done around the world through assistance from the United States, the incredible work that the NED has done in supporting civil society, including citizen election monitors, both to help each other learn better, to counter authoritarian learning with democratic learning, democratic innovation, and the solidarity networks from one another when they're under pressure is incredibly important. These peer-to-peer support and stability to organizations that now are decades old, they're really proof of the sustainability of democracy assistance and the citizen efforts, not our assistance, but of their efforts. The international solidarity around these things and sending out the assistant secretary and deputy assistant secretary to places like Azerbaijan is incredibly important. Building networks, but to reinforce and expand norms, not to let the normative process stop, but to push more freedom of expression, more openness in government, more access to information, including electoral-related data that you need to be able to do a factual analysis about whether things are genuine or phony, is really very important. And for us to be energetic and innovative. So I won't have to say anything else today.
Can I?
Sure, of course.
Just really quickly, oops, I turned myself off. To respond, Chris, to your question and to some of the things that Tom. Yes, it's certainly clear that professionals in the field and foreign policy professionals in various governments around the world and around the region put no credibility in the statements of the kinds of organizations that I described. There's no question about that. We all know who the fakes or who the phonies are. But I don't think that their statements and their activities are pitched at the professionals. They're not pitched at people like us. They're pitched at a completely different audience. And the first is domestically, Chris, as you pointed out, in enabling Moscow in this case, but it's not unique to Moscow to build the narrative domestically that it is acting fundamentally the same way that the United States and its allies act in any given situation. One is as democratic as the other. There is fundamentally no difference between the two. And we can document that by quoting these organizations who the average person in the street who's watching our TV couldn't distinguish from one another if their lives depended on it. That's not the point. So I think there is value in us being aware that it's important to call things what they are, and that there are legitimate organizations and there are illegitimate organizations, and I worry about simply saying that we all know better. The second area, of course, other than domestically, where the Russians are attempting to use input from these kinds of groups, is in the borderlands and in countries in which either Russian TV is easily understood and widely viewed, or the English and other language versions of the Russian narrative are widely heard. And I think that applies to pretty much any country in Western Europe today. And again, if we look at RTV in German, or if we look at other outlets in Spanish, I think these kinds of inputs from these phony groups make it fundamentally more difficult for governments which are thinking about taking a stronger stand vis-a-vis Moscow to do so because of public opinion in their countries. And last, and I'll just be very brief, I think we all agree that elections matter. And we saw an election in Greece not too very long ago in which the radical left won handily and has entered a coalition now with a party in which the senior leadership has very deep and very broad personal and economic and political ties to Moscow. And I don't want to be, running around saying the sky is falling, but I am extremely worried about the government that obtains after the elections in Spain, because Podemos will be a significant factor in the future of Spanish policy, and that will have an impact on how relations with Moscow are defined. You know, okay, so I'll leave it at that. And then the big one, of course, you know, many of the observers who are on these kinds of missions are French. They're French MPs, they're French MEPs. You know, these are not lowlifes off the street. They have a position, and they have the ability in their domestic media markets to comment. And in France in particular, they come from the National Front. And, you know, we're not that far from a place where someone from the National Front may be running France. To me, that matters. I think, you know, I don't want to completely fall back into the Cold War again, but clearly the Russians believe that it's worth the investment. There's an awful lot of money and an awful lot of time and an awful lot of effort going into this. And it may not be to change a decision by the West on any given place at any given time, but it creates a narrative over time in Western that, you know, our institutions are every bit as democratic as yours. And, you know, I admit that the political elite will not buy that, but there are many people that make up public opinion who will.
Tom, do you want to?
Well, I certainly agree that folks should do the analysis and research and discussion and exposés and call the phony elections and those who would seek to falsely validate them. You know, so I'm not against doing any of that. Again, my point was more about where are we in the climate change, you know, process. And I don't think that we're at a point where we should despair about these efforts yet. We should pay attention to them and counter them appropriately. But I mean, again, you'd have to be a fool to be fooled by some of these groups. You know, you'd have to have a PhD in something esoteric. Any cab driver in Luhansk or in Azerbaijan or in, you know, any other place can tell you what the nature of their political process is. You don't need a PhD for that. So they're not fooling the people of their own countries whose elections are being stolen from them. They're not fooling the attentive international community. They may be distracting or confusing. You described the useful idiots, to coin a phrase, Jan. So there is that, but that's always been true. I mean, you know, phony election observers, I remember the first time I went to Yemen in 1993, we were working with a local group to do domestic election monitoring. And magically, you know, a few days before the election, a much better funded, better media access kind of gongo showed up to present an alternative statement on the elections without actually monitoring the elections. So, I mean, this is not just, you know, the last 20 years. I'm sure it's as old as propaganda and disinformation. So, again, that's out there. It happens. We should be appropriately responsive. But they're not winning in the big sense. They're not fooling people into thinking that they're more legitimate than they are. But I do want to pick up on one thing that Jan said about the false assertion from authoritarian regimes that we're all the same. I think that is real. And it's not just that they are as democratic as we are, it's that we are no more democratic than they are. And this is where our attention to our own democratic practices, our own human rights standards, our own behavior at home and abroad is so important. That we need to always be trying to improve our democracy and our treatment of immigrants, minorities, the vulnerable, the alienated, the unpopular, and demonstrate as best we can that this is what we claim to be, an inclusive democracy, as part of the response to that we actually are different. There are different, better opportunities for political participation here and for change of government when the voters want it, when the time has run out on any given public official or majority in a legislature. So we need to always be attentive to our own performance to demonstrate that we do have a better option. And that's part of it. And then part of it is, providing the appropriate replies to the false assertions when they come. But don't dismay.
So why don't we do questions, if you can identify yourself after the mic comes. Let's start here with Dmitry.
Thank you very much. Dmitry Dubrovsky, I'm Reagan Fellow from Russia, St. Petersburg. Thank you very much for all, and especially for Jan Surotchak for your description, although I would add more organization, of course, because of the list of them. And previously, that's interesting, that was the attempt to organize the observers, well, internationally, like for the new independent states observers, you know. Then that failed, they turned to another story. And my question is, do you believe it's possible to warn our European colleagues to legitimize this NGO within the country? Because what we are suffering in Russia very much, in the situation when the number of European colleagues sometimes meet and very actively collaborated with the Gongo, and then this Gongo turn to the main expert in the different matters, including observation, including election. I can give an example of Citizen Watch. The title was stealing from the St. Petersburg organization, and it was just, it was the radar attack on the organization, and it was created in your organization in Moscow, and then they started to make official observers in Moscow election. And because of that, the European colleagues started to collaborate with this organization, and for now they tend to be more acceptable. So my question is, do you believe it's possible to somehow create a, I don't know, blacklist or just a statement about what kind of organization within the country and outside the country could be acceptable as a professional and credible? Thank you.
Dmitry, it's an interesting point that's been raised, in a number of who monitors the monitors, and how do you establish, the list of those that are credible and those that are not. Could there be such an effort? Yes. Would you find some people who have the international credibility that they would be listened to? And I think, yes, that's possible. On the other side, there is how to identify those who are credible. So there is the European Platform for Democratic Elections, which goes across Eurasia and Western Europe with a lot of civic organizations. Many of them are supported by the NED. The European Network of Election Monitoring Organizations, NMO, which are made up of the credible citizen groups in all of Central Europe and Eurasia, and Tom was involved in, while he was at NDI, in the creation of NMO. They belong to the GENDEM, the Global Network of Domestic Election Monitors. So, it's possible. Part of what I think needs to be done is for us to help the media. And this is another, NED project. We need to help the media in terms of be able to have free expression, free press, and to be able to play their watchdog roles. That's absolutely true. We also need to help the media identify how to go deeper into the manipulation of various election processes to understand, not just to show up on election day and try to make some pronouncements. The Guardian and the New York Times have done some very interesting work on how to look at elections, and I think there could be some interesting seminar work done about that. And the third thing is how to help the international media that's deemed credible and has influence know how to discern between the phonies and the legitimate, the credible citizen election observers and credible international observers and the zombie or otherwise not credible observers. So I think all of those things fit into your point.
I agree with everything Pat just said. I would only add that I think the same kind of process needs to happen among political party elites in Brussels and in the major Western European capitals, so that, and it goes back to something that Pat talked about in his presentation earlier on. Some of these folks who go out on these things are just tourists, and they do it well-intended. They don't really know that they're being used. So be a lot more clearer and a lot more committed to calling things what they are. and, letting our friends and colleagues in the European Parliament and in the parliaments of the major West European capitals understand who's and who is legitimate and who is not. And frankly, I don't think we've done a very good job of that.
I think there was, go right here across from Dimitri.
Yeah. My name's Ryan Johnson, Peace Corps, Kyrgyz Republic. You mentioned strengthening media, but I was just wondering, and just being a good example, living up to our ideals. But how would you actually recommend fighting against whataboutism and false equivalency actually in the near abroad, in Kyrgyzstan, in Central Asia, the Caucasus, the places in which things like RT and Sputnik completely overwhelm the international media?
Just preface a response, if anyone wants to speak, by saying that's a question for a whole nother panel. It's really it's a big question, but if anyone wants to take a shot to start.
I'll answer a different question.
Well, I mean, whataboutism is an important point, and I think part of it is we have to help democratic innovation. We have to help the groups like Golos in Russia who are able to use the internet effectively, make use of mapping and other visualization tools to reach out. We have to help groups in Zimbabwe, as has been done, to circumvent the closing down of telecommunication systems by using clever little devices that, when you hook them, all these various cell phones together, it operates as a network, but you can't identify that there's actually a network. The way we helped people in Burma before it began to open up, train the human rights observers on what to look for in elections and to send out through their Samisat-like networks the information that then went up onto Burma Election Watch. There are a lot of ways, and I just think it's a battle for the narrative. And it's how to be more effective and energetic in putting forward the truth so that it is not subverted by disinformation. And there are many different ways to try to do that, and I think those of us in this room have a lot of ideas, and many in this room have been very effective in coming up with such devices. But there's no one answer, and there's no short answer to this.
I would just add to that, I think the degree to which Russian language media is influenced on the Russian Federation's periphery is a real question, because the degree of resource is so enormous there. There's another question once you move a bit farther out from the Russian language sphere, where RT and others are using English and French and German language. It will require a lot more serious investment from democratic media, I put it at that level. So I have Mark and then Tabish.
Mark Plattner, Journal of Democracy. I want to respond or pose a question to Tom, right, as to the question of whether the overall bearing of that issue is excessively gloomy. It also has to do with the question of democratic norms. I would say up until a year ago or so, I remained an optimist, and largely on the grounds that I think you more or less suggested, Tom, which is that somehow the world had accepted the idea that democracy was the standard, and all these organizations and people were appealing to democratic norms. The fact that the authoritarians even were trying to disguise themselves as Democrats was just one more sign of the triumph of democracy. There are lots of reasons why I'm more dubious a year later, but one is, at what point does the violation, the distortion of those norms become so great that one can no longer think of it simply as a kind of tribute to their excellence and their dominance, but it threatens to bring the whole thing down, to confuse people to such a degree that they no longer have a real sense of what it is that is being appealed to. So I think that's where my concern would be, in terms of this question of norms. Not that professionals are going to accept the reports of the kinds of groups that Jan mentioned, but that the whole question of what's really democracy and and it partly gets to the question of whataboutism and so on. But anyway, let me leave it.
Follow up on that? I was going to say something. What's interesting about this discussion actually is not election monitoring, but the underlying issue. And so it's worth addressing. Does it matter? Maybe it doesn't matter. He's going to do okay, and so just bide our time, and we don't have to do anything, except maybe observe those elections so people can have something to refer to and so forth. But I think it is significant. The question is, what are we really talking about here? For example, in Latin America, you have this whole notion that the OAS is supposed to act if there's an alteration of the democratic order. It's happening in Venezuela and nobody's saying a word. And it's getting worse and worse. Why are we seem to be incapable of responding in a more forceful way to Ukraine? And what is at stake there? Is there anything really at stake for us, or is this a European problem that we can just leave for the French and the Germans to worry about? And, what I worry about now is that we have because of what Andy Nathan in the journal calls, the lower prestige of democracy. It affects our ability to affirm it. In other words, we should never get on our high horse because, who are we? Who are we? And if you really feel that way, how in God's name can you exercise leadership in the world? Can you affirm your values? Can you represent democracy? If it's all, and it is really that it's been muddied, and it's very effectively muddied, and I think that's what the whole objective is. And, I was at a meeting in the Czech Republic in December, organized by the Foreign Ministry, and I'll tell you, they were talking more about Ferguson and U.S. torture than they were about any of these things you're talking about. Tell me that's not a problem.
Yeah, these are serious ideas and complicated. I may not be up to sustaining the conversation at the level that Mark and Carl have elevated it to. But my point was not that democracy will do okay by itself, therefore we don't have to do anything. Au contraire. My point is that there's a lot for us to do. I'm not sure it's always as militarily oriented as Carl would prefer in Middle East or in Eastern Europe. But those are things we can discuss. But what we're finding is that there are more and more people running countries who don't accept the premise, right? The liberal idea, the end of history argument that Frank wrote, many years ago now. I don't think governs. Because there are a lot of people pushing back. And it's not, pushing back because they want an Islamic state or that. I'm more concerned about the people that want to manipulate democratic forms for authoritarian ends. Because that's more universally embraced in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, in South Asia, in parts of Latin America and Africa, certainly. So I think we need, so there's a lot of phoniness, not just in elections, but in other parts of governance. And we need to be smarter about determining who we believe, right? And certainly we as a government have lots of partners in the world that we're doing a lot of business with. And they claim to us that they're trying to govern justly and democratically, but they're not. They don't accept the premise that their countries will be more stable if they're more inclusive and respectful of people's rights. They just don't believe that. Right? So we go in and we try to persuade governments that they will be more stable and prosperous and at peace with their neighbors if they become more democratic. And they don't believe that. They don't, because it affects their personal or their group's hold on power. And we're not good enough yet about being able to separate the wheat from the chaff in this discussion internationally, I would say. There's a lot of people that have gone to our universities, been fellows, and gone back to their uncles, their fathers, their clans' government, so they can talk our language very well, and I don't just mean unaccented English. And they talk about how they need our help to be more inclusive and tolerant and so on. And they don't believe it. They just don't. I mean, they are using the trappings of democratic governance to paper over what are, kleptocracies, which are clan fights, which are tribal in various ways, ideological or ethnic or religious. And so the efforts to suborn a democratic process and to be non-responsive to people's legitimate aspirations is a widening phenomenon. I'm not gloomy yet, but I think we haven't elevated our game to respond well enough yet. And by we, I don't just mean the U.S. government, although I include that. I mean all of us intellectually and programmatically. We need to find a way to identify our allies and the people who really share our values more shrewdly than we sometimes have. I don't have the answer to this, but I think we've got to do more, not less. I think we got lazy in and out of government in the 1990s, right, with what happened in the fall of communism and its echoes in the Arab world, Yemen and the Palestinian Authority and other places were echoes of the collapse of the Soviet backstop. That was true in parts of Africa. That was true in parts of Asia. So there was a lot of easy pickings for countries that were moving towards democracy in the 1990s. And so I think we got greedy and lazy. We thought they were all moving this way, and they weren't. And the people who were coasting along for a while in various regimes have reasserted themselves. I mean, Putin in Russia is the most conspicuous and successful example of this, right? He went from being a deputy mayor of a major city, working for somebody who was arguably a Democrat, if also perhaps a little thumb on the scales sometimes, to a full-fledged authoritarian autocrat. So so I think we should do more, not less, Carl. So I agree with your punchline, even if we could discuss how do we get there.
So give Jan and Pat a chance to add, and then we'll take the last couple of questions.
Wow. Thanks, Carl, for identifying the elephant in the room. And I'd say that with a sort of a Republican elephant tinge. I think Tom's exactly right. We have, and I'm a Europeanist, so I'm only going to talk about Europe. I can't talk about anything else. I don't know anything else. I don't even know Europe all that well. We have abandoned the fight. We simply are no longer a player, and I understand I'm overstating, but we are simply no longer a player in the battle for the hearts and minds of the populations in the countries in which we have invested so much time and so much effort and so much human capital in my little part of the world since the collapse of the wall in 1989. We are simply no longer a player in the public fight for opinion and thought, certainly in the younger generations. There is this, there's the dissident generation that's out there still that, has a sort of a rosy idea of us and of who we say we are. But I would argue, and again, I'd be happy to have anybody push back. I think for anybody who's under 40, in the swath of territory from Estonia in the north through the Balkans in the south, the history of their lives is America as a retreating force. And I would argue, and let's just talk about one specific example, and some of the people up here may disagree with me, but I think we all collectively believe that the course of developments in Hungary is one of the greatest concerns in what we believed was accomplished democratic space. The truth is that what Orbán Viktor says really expresses opinion that is, to be found in all the countries of the region. Most apparently and most deeply felt probably in Hungary, but not only there. And, I think of course, Mr. Putin was just in Budapest yesterday. I think for people like Viktor Orban and others in the region, there's some amount of this that's just simple math. He needs to make a calculation about which large ally is likely to be most able to enable him to protect and defend the people of Hungary. And caught where he is, and caught where countries like his are, when they're not seeing their preferred ally deliver that security and dependability, they're going to look for somebody else. And I think that's exactly what he's done. And frankly, if I were in his shoes, I'd be tempted to do the same thing.
Frankly, I love this question, as you know. Both of you know. I think about this like in personal terms, but in abstract terms as well. I don't know how many in the room have seen the movie Selma. There are a couple of things that I'd draw out for this conversation from Selma. The first thing is the United States was not a glowing beacon to the world without any flaws in the 1950s or before the 1950s or in the 1960s or the 1990s. What Selma represented to me, and still does represent to me, is the determination of people to make democracy work. I heard John Lewis last week, speak about where things have come in the last 100 years and where things have come in the last 30 years. And what it reminded me again was that it's not just a movie, it's our lifetime. And not just the lifetimes of those of us who are gray like myself, but those who are just in the schools and coming into the schools now. So in one sense, Tom Melia started by making reference to getting our act together at home. And I see Tova Wang sitting out here who's written a lot about electoral rights in this country and how that's part of projecting onto the international scene. I think that's really important. But more important, Carl and Mark, is our own resolve. The second thing that I know, Carl, you and I have talked about before, at 23, when I first came to Washington to the Institute for Policy Studies as Mark Raskin's understudy, the coup in Chile had just happened, right after I arrived. And while, I opposed the war in Vietnam eventually, as a blue-collar kid from upstate Pennsylvania, at 12 I was with the war, and I was against communism, but I came to see it a little bit differently. But I had no question in my mind when the coup happened in Chile, when over 120 years of uninterrupted constitutional democracy was overthrown because of a weak socialist being in power. It made me change my focus from domestic civil rights, community empowerment activities somewhat to international affairs, part of why I'm here today. But what we asked ourselves at IPS and sitting there with the late Orlando Letelier, who later was assassinated along with one of my friends, Ronnie Moffett, was, is this going to be a 5-year classic Latin America military regime, or is this something that's based on a deeper set of roots that will be around 30 or more years? And the tactics for supporting the transition back to democracy in solidarity with the Chilean people had to be based upon whether we thought this was a long, drawn-out affair, something more like what World War II was about, where there was really a fascist ideology at work, or was this something that was more superficial? I think we're in a similar time. Recession or not, I can debate, but nonetheless, we're not in a time where things are bubbling around the world. But people are standing up. The Arab Spring was people standing up. A lot of it was reversed, and we know why. People in Africa, in a number of countries, Burkina and other places in these last few months have stood up. It's not just a joke that nobody is coming out to the streets to demand more authoritarianism. So you know better than me, both of you know better than me, and Tom Melia, who first invited me to participate in NDI, knows better than me. But this is something that I think muddying the waters is not just to confuse those who are standing on the shore from seeing what's going on. It's to confuse the fish. And the point is, I think the fish here, the people in these countries, see through the muddiness, and they see beyond the muddiness. And just like, I opened not by coincidence of saying that at the end of World War II, after the incredible battle against the most horrendous forms of authoritarianism, we still had the rise of the Iron Curtain and military dictatorships. And that at this moment, there is some setback and there is a lot of negativity, but the people in this room, stand together with people around the world who want to do more and who know the way to come out of a recession is to invest in the future. And I think that's it. We need more democratic investment. We need to be smarter about it. We need to be more innovative. And we need to look at where we always look, the people who are on the ground and putting their lives on the line to try to make a difference in their countries. And, there's no better example of providing that solidarity than what this institution stands for.
I'd like to just take one last question from our fellow Tabish, who, right there.
Thank you so much. It was very informative panel. My name is Tabish. I'm a Reagan Fassel Fellow. Fortunately or unfortunately, I have worked for the Election Commission of Afghanistan as a Chief of Staff. And recently, as a Harvard Electoral Integrity Project, we had conducted the third worst election in the world. My concern is not almost for the zombie or fake institutions which are overshadowing the legitimacy of the process, but I can give you an example of a very real example. Afghanistan's runoff conducted on June 14, but the election observation report of EU Election Assistance Mission released on December 16, 2014. They were part of the political settlement, and even within very credible institutions, domestic observation missions, they couldn't release the reports on time and updates, which could eventually help the electoral institutions to look on the results or maybe help us in other ways. My concern is that how to make sure that even credible institutions, original and genuine monitoring and observation groups are not linked to the political dilemma and not joining the political spectrum and giving the real outcome and findings of an electoral process. Thank you.
Somehow the green light never seems to go off when I'm... Look, I mean, the Afghanistan thing, I think, relates to a number of questions, right? It goes very, very deep into what it means to build a political process that's real politics, where there's an opposition that can operate and organize safely in all parts of a country, and where people can make up their minds without fear of intimidation or retribution, and where corruption is somehow not just free of the election process, but it's not a factor in society. I mean, when corruption is endemic, in my experience now, 20 years plus with NDI doing these things around the world, when Carl's right, it's not about elections. It's about things that are much deeper. Corruption corrodes the ability to have democratic politics, and it seeps into the electoral system. And I can give examples from many different countries, and certainly that's part of the problem in Afghanistan, whether it was this election or past elections. And not having the ability to face up to this issue and to confront these issues, multiple, in the country, coming out of the last elections, set the stage for the degree of fraud that was involved in these elections. Whether or not there was massive fraud on the scale of which was claimed is a different issue. Industrial scale fraud, and I was in Kabul during validation or the recount or whatever, their audit is the right term, as poorly conducted as the audit may have been, there were agents of both sides present. And if there had been industrial level fraud, it should have been relatively easy even for the international observers to have stumbled over. Most of the international observers did not see fraud at that level. And I debated with the European mission how to characterize what was seen. I think the problem is unless both sides there, both candidates and their agents, had seen that process through to a conclusion, we were doomed to a circumstance where one side would claim that it was incredible because they weren't present. We were left in a rough dilemma. And that part of elections that I talk about, that is, they're to resolve peacefully the struggle for political power, the nature of the election process was compromised. And the political compromise may have been a logical result of that. I wasn't in the room with Mr. Kerry when the deal was brokered. But I think, you know, that's a big problem. And this issue goes back to, just let me end by bringing up a completely different country. Kenya in 2008 came apart because it wasn't possible to determine who won those elections. An incredible reconstruction of governmental processes took place after that, not just the elections. It was the Supreme Court, it was many, many other things, a new constitution that led to a kind of stability in these last elections. But with the authoritarian trend going on in Kenya today, and this, I mean, we've only talked about the dramatic examples, but there are so many other examples of authoritarianism on the rise today. What will be the state of the 2018 elections in Kenya? I think this is a very important question, and that's why I come back to you, because the next elections in Afghanistan, if they're going to resolve peacefully power, we have to root out some of the problems, which basically relate to corruption. Sorry to sound like I'm preaching, you know, but I just saw Selma, so I can't help myself.
And I would note that Tabish has a fantastic article in Foreign Policy that was published recently on this subject. I know there were others who had questions, but we're already past time. I just want to take this opportunity to really thank all three of the speakers who addressed both the subject that we had as the title of the discussion, and they went well beyond it as well. So thank you to all three of you. Thanks to the audience, too.